One thing there is no shortage of on this campground is holes. So today's entire episode is going to be about holes. Holes on the campground and holes in the bottom of my pirate ship. You can see over here we've got a big old hole here with a bunch of sand in front. This is where the sandworms live, so it's very important to walk with that rhythm over here. Another big sandworm hole right here. There's a bunch all over this mound. A number of people have asked me to explain why I'm popping holes in the bottom of my boat. And I guess I didn't do a good job of explaining that initially. When I laid up this fiberglass, which is a combination of both fiberglass and epoxy, I had a lot of bubbles in my epoxy mixture, tiny little bubbles. And what I should have done when I laid this fiberglass up is done a real good job of using a squeegee to get all those bubbles popped and out of there. But it was my first project and I didn't know better, and so I didn't, and the bubbles didn't go away, they just dried with a bunch of little air bubbles underneath the surface here. So the problem is, if I find where there's an air bubble and I try to jab it with this little pointy thing, they pop relatively easily. Now if I go someplace where there's no air bubble and I try to jam into this, it's nice and solid. So there's just a thin little layer of epoxy there that's easily punctured. So I could just ignore that and paint over this, but as it rubs up against things and gets aged with time, those are going to start popping and it's going to make the paint job look nasty, and who wants that? If I'm going to put a lot more work into this, I want it to look good for a long time. Another issue too is that epoxy is not 100% waterproof. It does allow just little bits of water to pass through, especially if there's these small areas just below the surface of the epoxy. The water can leak in and accumulate there, and then it can actually start to cause a blister to form. You know, as the water expands and contracts, maybe it gets cold, gets hot, it'll start to actually push away the epoxy and fiberglass and can result in large blisters as that opens up the area, more water gets in, and so you can get really big pock marks all over your boat. So this is all basically preventative stuff to try to ensure that the paint job and the integrity of the boat lasts for a long time. Now another question was, instead of trying to pop all of these individually, couldn't I just sand the whole surface and sand the top of the bubbles off? And the answer is yes, and that may actually be a better idea. When I started popping these bubbles, I don't think I realized quite how many they are, and that is one of the things that I've learned by doing this. I thought that there was going to be fewer, and I didn't want to sand down and take off lots and lots of epoxy to fix only a few small holes. But seeing how many there are now, it probably would have been faster to do that. Additionally, trying to do them all individually like this, I've probably missed a whole bunch. And so to actually come back and try to get them all one by one would be a very time-consuming process. So I'm about done with trying to do this manually with just poking the holes, and I'm going to move on to doing sanding. Now I was planning to sand anyways, because even though these are exposed, it's all rough, and now that I've got these opened up, I really want to sand it here and make it something where I can come back and put in a filler to fill in those holes, so I can't have things being all nasty. They need to have much nicer edges and be much more in a condition where they're going to fill nicely. In professional grade epoxy work, one trick they use to avoid these air bubbles is they will actually have the work that they're working on cure inside a vacuum chamber. And so the vacuum chamber actually will suck the bubbles out if there are any and prevent fewer of these little bubble holes. But definitely, even without a vacuum chamber, I could have done a way better job on this. And as I said before, down below here, the layup is good. Most of the problem here is where I had the layup over my existing fiberglass, and if I had done a better job prepping the layer below, I probably would have had a much easier time getting the bubbles out, and it would have been nicer. So the real problem began with not preparing my surface well enough before I put on the next layer of fiberglass and epoxy.